everybody, welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We've got a good one for you as always. Let's get into it. We start with President Joe Biden, as he's risking a huge backlash from the left and from the right as he has to deal with this debt ceiling negotiation here. It's going to be pretty tense coming down to it. We'll look at how the negotiations are going and also give you an update on what some of the biggest leaders are saying. Meanwhile, Philadelphia's Helen Gim has a big race tomorrow. Josh Hawley will not let go of his manhood. John Schwartz reviews Josh Hawley's new book, attempting to connect to the young, conservative, struggling wayward man. As a young, some would say struggling leftist man, I will see how much this book resonates with me, and this concept resonates with me. Also, very interestingly, the United Auto Workers is refusing to endorse Joe Biden until he commits to backing certain things that they want. This may blow your minds. This may blow your minds, but it's something I'm going to do. I'm going to break that down for you, and I kind of give you details on what went into the decision, and I will give my opinion on whether or not I think it makes sense. Personally, and I hope if you've been listening to the show for longer than 2 seconds, you'll know my opinion. But either way, we'll have fun. We'll break it down. We will discuss it. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Spencer Walsh, and welcome to today's episode of Newsflash. All right, so we get started today with Joe Biden and the Republicans getting into this debt ceiling negotiation situation here. This is in Axios. Apparently the mood is optimism from the president, saying that he's optimistic of reaching a debt ceiling agreement with the Republicans and avoiding an unprecedented default. So pretty much really kind of remarkable rolling back on his position. I mean, this is someone who was completely unprepared, completely, had, a trifecta government for 2 years, failed to do anything about this issue. First of all, I think that's something a lot of people are forgetting, that this was like something that, could have been easily addressed. We could have raised the debt ceiling under, any time in the last 2 years that effort could have been pushed, because anyone with any sense knew that this was going to come down the pipe, if it was very likely that, it was a surprise how badly the Republicans did in the midterms. Like the conventional wisdom was Democrats were far more screwed than they were. If there were any time to say, why don't we get taken care of this debt ceiling, this could be a real hindrance to us next year, it was 2022 in the lead up to the election, or maybe late 2021. And that was just fundamentally not taken up. It was just not adopted at all. And Joe Biden, he plays this really kind of pathetic game of, we're not going to negotiate, we're going to stay strong, we're going to stay tough, we're not going to do anything to give the Republicans any kind of ground in this crazy situation. And they are really proposing some pretty drastic spending cuts. What they propose will not become final. I think everybody kind of knows that. But the question is, what kind of grant? Because the last time this happened in 2011, or 2014, Joe Biden almost helped Barack Obama put the final nail in the coffin of Social Security, and that's not a joke. So, according to Axios, Biden told reporters in Delaware that he's expecting to resume talks with congressional leaders on Tuesday, and he plans to leave for the G7 summit in Japan 1 day later, per a pool report. Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California have agreed to postpone a meeting on the matter of the debt scheduled for Friday to give more aides more time to talk, as the U.S. faces the threat of hitting the debt ceiling as early as June 1st. Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adamio told CNN that the conversations are constructive between all parties. But so he says, I remain just optimistic because I'm a congenial optimist, said Biden. But I think there is really desire on their part as well as ours to reach an agreement, because they do want concessions here. That's why they're holding this up, because they do want concessions. And the question is how giving up anything at this point is an admission of defeat, frankly, if you're Joe Biden, because this is an agreement, this is a pickle that you should not have been forced into. Republicans should not get to, under your administration or under any time, be able to hold the economy hostage for spending cuts and more austerity. Taking money out of people's pockets that needed the absolute most in exchange for, just whatever personal policy priority the Republicans can to seem to like squeeze out of the Biden administration, which is really quite remarkable. McCarthy offered a less optimistic assessment, saying the two sides were far apart in negotiations, so probably trying to want to ham it up a little bit. But meanwhile, Biden, oh no, he may finally be getting some pressure from his left. So Pramila Jayapal of Washington, probably one of the weakest elected progressives out there, well known for caving to Joe Biden kind of at a moment's notice and just very, very comfortable, listening to him and trusting him and going along with what he says, had this to say, quote, "It's really important that we don't give ground on several areas, including welfare work requirements, energy permitting reform," which is something that Joe Manchin has been pushing with his ties, deep ties, personal ties to the fossil fuel industry. We made it clear that if they give on these core democratic values, there will be huge backlash, adding there will also be backlash at the polling booth. And honestly, if I were looking at this here in the Joe Biden White House, I don't know if I'd be very intimidated, frankly, because, there's going to be a real if someone keeps promising a real backlash, or not even promises, but, is now suddenly threatening a real backlash after being very loyal to you throughout time, despite a lot of pressure and incentive not to be, if I'm the Democratic Joe Biden White House, I'd be like, okay, Pramila, do some, we hear you, we see you, we respect you. And then just be like, all right, let's get down to business. Let's do those work requirements. Let's definitely do this permitting reform. And then, let's score a political victory, bipartisanship for the Republicans ahead of 2024. And that's the kind of the mindset. If I were Joe Biden, that's what I would be saying. Because Pramila Jayapal has shown time and time again, she's not going to do anything. She's going to say, there's going to be a real backlash with progressives not turning out and progressives not supporting. But, Biden will throw the smallest carrot their way, the most meaningless, emptiest, hollowest carrot there possibly could be. And then guess who's going to gobble it up and say, we will support Biden in 2024. It's great to see him out and running again. Exactly, Pramila Jayapal, and I'm sure Ro Khanna will come up in this sooner rather than later. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said the White House can't expect pushback on nearly any significant concession. This is not an appropriate vehicle. I don't think we should normalize such destructive tactics. And AOC talking sense there. This is not something that we should be normalizing. This is not an acceptable way to extract. She's saying it's not the vehicle, it's not the way that people should be extracting concessions from the government, because this is something. This is kidnapping our global economy, taking up to the highest floor of the Empire State Building, and say just dangling by the hair, and being because it's pretty damn close to June 1st right now, and that is complete disaster for not just U.S. but for the entire globe, and it is pretty much is like saying holding global economy by the hair off the tallest part of the Empire State Building and saying, I'm going to let you go if you don't give us Medicare work requirements or Medicaid work requirements and permanent reform. That is what they're doing. And Biden's like, okay, well, maybe we can do Medicare permanent reform, but we definitely can't do we can't do our Medicare work requirements. We definitely can't do permanent reform. It's just ridiculous. It's you should be calling the police. You should be tackling this guy. You should be, this is something that is absolutely crazy, and it's really kind of a hostage situation. So, Biden, and really it shows you also the fact that the squad is coming out there and saying this in this way. It shows you that they are really thinking about and are quite concerned about giving something up, because either Biden, there's a really bad concession floating around, and at least around the camp of the squad, and the squad's starting to get a little nervous because we've seen in the past they can be incredibly the last thing that they want to do is say any bad word towards Joe Biden. And the fact that they are coming out and doing this, really sticking their neck out, is talking about, I'm very, very concerned, especially in the key voting matters. It could be some kind of side thing. They'll pay a little bit of lip service towards Biden too, maybe some of the more relevant ones as well. But when it comes down to it, it's just what in the world have you? You have no track record of any kind of resistance, so it's very, very hard to get anything good. The progressive lawmaker shared concerns that Biden risks emboldening Republicans to make future demands if he abandons his refusal to sign anything. other than a clean debt ceiling increase. It makes us look weak. It's profoundly destructive, and it also threatens to weaken the president, said Ocasio-Cortez and Bowman. Bowman saying, we look like we don't know, what we are doing. Several parts of the House GOP bill, work requirements, energy permitting, permitting reform, COVID aid clawbacks, and discretionary spending caps are on the table in staff level talks that have been going on since last week. I could see some COVID aid clawbacks being passed off as a pretty solid win, but anything else on that I think actually could meet some really serious pushback. Several parts of that bill are on the table. Some Republicans, including House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, lambasted the White House publicly on Monday, alleging slow progress and refusal to budge on demand for a clean debt ceiling release. And of course, McCarthy, gets a lot more incentives to making it positive or making it negative. And of course, Biden, being the the bipartisan type of guy that he is, will love to say, things are going great. I'm optimistic. We're pushing strong. We're chugging strong, Jack. We'll get this through. Because that is the ultimately kind of bipartisan sycophant that he is. We'll see, of course, how it works.
My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say, so please do those steps, make SWRN content better, and thank you so much for listening.
So just after a month, here the story in the New Yorker, over a month after Brandon Johnson was elected mayor of Chicago, another Democrat endorsed by Bernie Sanders has a chance to govern a major U.S. city. Philadelphia's Helen Gim, a former city council member who has secured the top spot of AOC and Jamal Bowman, is a top contender in Tuesday's Democratic primary. If Gim prevails, and there's no guarantee given the number of viable contenders, progressives will capture a remarkable run of victories in mayoral races that were once the domain of these machine-backed moderates. This is Philadelphia, Chicago. It was a huge deal. L.A., a pretty impressive situation. Michelle Wu in Boston, very good pickup for them. But a year ago, big city progressives appeared to be struggling relatively mightily. I think that largely was overplayed. Chesa Boudin was, I think, a largely isolated incident, especially because Larry Krasner won so well in Philadelphia. The year before, a uniquely bad politician facing uniquely strong headwinds, I think is fair to say. Los Angeles was gearing up for a recall of its own left-leaning district attorney, and the future mayor there appeared to be Rick Caruso, a billionaire real estate developer and former Republican. Adams in New York was still riding relatively high, and surges in crime and homelessness coming on the heels of a pandemic that ravaged many downtowns were supposed to bolster the prospects of Democrats explicitly opposed to progressives and leftists who rose to prominence in the late 2010s. Many of those progressives were derided as Pollyannish and unserious about public disorder. Boudin's defeat, in retrospect, may not have been when the urban left bottomed out. Los Angeles did not recall Gascon. Caruso lost to Karen Bass, a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and Adams has seen his approval ratings tumble. Wu has made progress on a pretty ambitious rent control proposal, and Johnson finishing ahead of incumbent Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who famously said, Brandon Johnson will never be mayor. Edged out Paul Vallis, a former Chicago Public Schools CEO and tough-on-crime moderate. Gim, like Wu, would be the city's first female and Asian American mayor. She's a crucial link to Johnson through Paul Vallis, who, in addition to running Chicago's schools, spent half a decade as the executive in charge of Philadelphia's public schools as well. Johnson found success in savaging Vallis' record as schools chief, which came with notable triumphs and headline-grabbing controversies that never quite faded. An enthusiastic proponent of charter schools, Vallis has clashed with the teachers union and public school parents in multiple cities, and found himself running against one particularly fierce activist in Philadelphia, Gim. So a decade before Gim was elected to the city council, she was tangling with Vallis while he was the leader of Parents United for Public Education, an organization she'd founded to fight for more public school funding. As Vallis allowed the takeover of some public schools by for-profit companies and private nonprofits, and enacted polarizing punishment regime for problematic students, he found himself pitted against Gim, a former teacher and newspaper reporter. As an activist and politician, Gim had never been shy about her ideology. She called capitalism an immoral system that rejects organized labor, housing as human rights, and health care for all. In the 2000s, she was known for her activism around Philadelphia's Chinatown, opposing the construction of a baseball stadium there. Locals decried the use of public funds and potential to displace residents, and helping Asian American students at the South Philadelphia High School win a federal civil rights case when they were bullied and harassed. Though victory, as we take a look at the state of race here in the New Yorker Mag, is far from assumed, Rebecca Reinhart, a city controller and supporter of charter schools, has been effectively tied in the polls with Gim and Sherelle Parker, a former city council member running to Gim's right as kind of the traditionally African-American machine candidate. The primary is the most expensive in Philadelphia's history, thanks in part to Alan Dom, a real estate developer who's pumps at least $5 million of his own cash into the campaign. Jeff Brown, a wealthy owner of a supermarket chain, rounds out the upper echelon of tough contenders. Some of the challenges for the next Philadelphia mayor, regardless of ideology, are pretty sobering. More than 500 people were murdered in both 2021 and 2022 in Philadelphia per capita, making one of the deadliest U.S. cities. A canvasser for a progressive group supporting Gim fatally shot another canvasser over what police suggest may have been an old beef, which is pretty crazy. The poorest residents, it was pretty good that that wasn't turned on Gim and her campaign there, at least. But the poorest residents struggle with persistent gun violence, joblessness, and substandard housing. Jim Kenney, the term-limited Democratic mayor, has drawn outrage for expressing his own dissatisfaction with the job, and every other candidate in the field, to varying degrees, has distanced themselves from him. There will be no election past May 16th. That is obviously today. That matters. Philadelphia lacks a runoff system, so the victor with the plurality in the Democratic primary will head to the general election. In every sense, of course, that race will be a formality because Philadelphia is a heavily Democratic city, obviously. In Philadelphia, as in Chicago, crime has emerged as the top-tier campaign issue. None of the candidates is an explicit supporter anymore of defunding the police, though Gim, Dom, and Parker joined most of the city council in 2020 to redirect a portion of police funding to other city services, only to reverse course later. Parker, vying to become the Philadelphia's fourth black mayor, wants to hire 300 new police officers and implement a version of stop and frisk, which is really quite crazy, to say the least. Reinhart, who is white, has tried to split the difference on reform and tougher policing strategies, giving officers greater arrest power while supporting job training and violence interruption initiatives. So a very kind of liberal meritocratic approach that we've been trying ever since Ferguson, and has failed. Gim is proposing aggressive social safety net investments to reduce crime. She wants to pump cash into mental health crisis response units, violence interrupters, and a bolstered 911 response system, as well as more detectives to improve homicide rate clearances initiatives similar to what Johnson campaigned on in Chicago. The primary forecasted of a pretty low turnout will test Philadelphia's burgeoning progressive and leftist campaign infrastructure. And again, this is what we're going to see. Got to look for youth vote. Got to look for can it just go beyond that kind of critical, typical progressive white bro coalition. You're like the West Philly kind of area in this case, equivalent to I don't know, Brooklyn in New York, or the north side of Chicago, the North Shore of Chicago. So yeah, Larry Krasner is a pretty good testament to how to do it right. He's the unabashedly left-wing district attorney. He's won citywide twice despite deep opposition from the local police union. Really just rabid, frankly, opposition. And conservatives. Philadelphia's DSA chapter, one of the nation's most active, has not formally endorsed her, citing a need to send volunteers to the Socialist City Council candidates, but released a statement in April urging members to cast their votes for Helen Gim. Because, when you get endorsed by someone like the CTU in Chicago or DSA in Philadelphia, they will actually, send material resources, mostly in the form of volunteers and door knockers, to your campaign. Sanders, along with Ocasio-Cortez, joined Gim for a rally on Sunday. The Working Families Party, meanwhile, channeled significant resources into Gim's campaign. She's definitely kind of a working families, is more of as opposed to a DSA type of gal, but it is a very, very big deal. For Adams, though, Eric Adams up here in New York, a Gim victory might be unnerving. In 2 years, he'll face his own re-election, and many leftist Senate Democrats who have failed to rally around potent candidate to halt his ascent will have a chance to learn from their 2021 missteps. And boy, is the New York City DSA organized, and boy, are they fuming and chomping at the bit to get another chance at this guy for sure. We'll see how they do tomorrow in Philadelphia. But now we will shift gears a little bit to talking about men. Specifically masculinity, manliness, especially when it comes to the right wing. They've always tried to play it out. They've always tried to push for it. They value it in their candidates. Donald Trump was portrayed as Rambo. He was called by his own staff the most, to the public at least, the most masculine president to ever hold the White House. Before that, George W. Bush in his cowboy hats was made a really big deal of being a man as well. G. Gordon Liddy said Bush's flight suit made the best of his manly character. Talking about his time, I guess, in the Air Force or whatever. Bush's one-time chief speechwriter, Michael Gerson, described him as possessing a manly humor. I don't know what that... Does he tell, sex jokes then? I don't even know what that means. But there was a Vietnam War, a manly endeavor, persecuted by Nixon's manly men, such as Henry Kissinger, and his assistant, Anthony Lake, who... When Anthony Lake objected to the intense U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, Kissinger told Lake to man up. So, again, just doing the tough things you don't really want to do, but you have to do because it's good for the country. A.k.a. good for the bottom line, good for myself. That is kind of the apotheosis of conservative masculinity and kind of manliness culture. Practitioners of this politics perceive themselves as exemplars of masculinity, even as they fear manliness in general as being sapped from society by the forces of darkness. And they're the only ones who can really, truly, potentially save it from the trainees and the woke people and the people coming to make your life worse and worse and worse. As they say it, practitioners of the politics, again, that's what their whole goal is. For example, Kissinger once told Gerson that radical Islam was trying to humiliate us, and we need to humiliate them. Nixon referred to our Vietnamese enemies as, quote, little cocksuckers. Hate to use the language there. But it's what he said. So what our president said. A few years before, in 1965, the U.S. had supported a massive bloodbath in Indonesia, in which at least 500,000 people were slaughtered. The Indonesian military justified this by claiming that the communist witches had castrated several army generals. This fear goes back as far as humans do. The 1486 expose of witchcraft, Malleus Maleficarum, according to John Schwartz here, proved that witches can, via sorcery, truly and actually remove man's members. Well, now, as he informs us, we have, unfortunately, a new addition to this tradition of conservative masculinity analysis, I guess. And that is, of course, the manliest man of them all. He wrote a book about manhood. That is Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri. Manhood, the masculine virtues America needs. Before you ask, the answer to your question is no. In a book called Manhood, Hawley never mentions the most famous act of his life, running away from protesters in the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The protesters he had earlier in the day saluted with a raised fist of solidarity, which honestly, I hate to say it, but I kind of forgot he did that. Of course, he was, raising the fist. It was an iconic thing, when they're all outside and, nice and safe away from him, not getting their, peasant dirt on him. But when they actually got in, there's, of course, a really famous video that came out through the January 6th hearings of him just kind of tearing down the halls when his friends finally made it inside. How can Hawley tell us, you might ask, that a man might be willing to give his life for others, willing to act boldly to face death, yet not say anything about his well-known sprint of self-preservation? How can he at the same time condemn liberals because they flee from trial and pain, when he literally fled from any kind of, it may not have even been a trial. They may have been happy to see him, That would have been fine. Well, your guess is as good as mine. My assumption is that it's because the U.S. right has created an entire self-contained fantasy world, which is totally true, and Hawley's never going to have to answer for doing anything like that in any kind of substantive way. Notably, Manhood is published by the conservative Regenerate, where editors presumably understand Hawley's readers won't want any intrusions from unpleasant reality. Manhood is somehow both short and long. The book, of course. Short because it's an op-ed stretched to barely 200 pages, and long because it's preternaturally boring. There are zero jokes, not even a single wry remark. Consuming it is like eating a small but dense log of suet. Hawley's thesis is that America's men are in crisis, fathering children out of wedlock, failing at jobs, committing crime, playing video games. You heard, I'm sure there's porn in there, mentioned several times. Epicurus taught us. He's just like the kind of, I don't know. I've never been to any kind of Christian school or anything like that, but I picture him as this like older guy at this kind of Christian school who, pats you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, buddy, you need to find Jesus. You're a good man, but you need to learn to get your life together." Just some absolutely cringy thing like that. But instead of doing that, he's patting you on the shoulder and said, "Hey, don't let these liberals turn you all feminine." So Epicurus taught us the universe is neither planned or orderly. Hawley summarized this: mankind should put the gods aside and focus on what really matters, which he said, pleasure, happiness, and things like that. The trick was to arrange one's life and society in such a way to allow maximum choice for pursuing pleasure. This is not at all actually what Epicurus said. Apparently he thought pleasure was the end, he wrote that pleasure is the end, but emphasized the pleasures of living prudently and honorably and justly, which, I mean, hey, who's to say Josh Hawley isn't living prudently, honorably, and justly, Why judge? But anyway, there is another philosophy of life as found in the Bible. It says man was created as God's image and called to perform God's work. In Genesis, the Garden of Eden is the only place, in fact, of order and flourishing. When we learn anything of the land beyond Eden's borders, it appears untamed, wild. Dark forces lurk there. The job of men is not to give into their hedonistic yearnings, but assume the yoke of manhood and subdue what is yet wild. The problem is that there are dark forces that might resist this mighty work, i.e. the Epicurean liberals, because the Epicureans believe that only base sensuality and giving no thought for the morrow, pretty much saying, they just want to have fun, they don't care about the long-term future. These Epicurean liberals that Hawley is kind of talking about here. Hawley turns this idea into a book by essentially repeating it at you 700 times. Liberals want to have fun, want to have a baby before they get married, and conservatives, the more natural, more structured people, are doing it the right way. So the liberal Epicureans, he informs us, would want us to abolish masculinity altogether, but that would be a horrible mistake. To illustrate this, he relates a tale from his wife's family, who had a homestead in New Mexico in the 1860s. It was occasionally menaced by the region's most notorious outlaw, Captain William Coe, who was known for his murdering and pillaging habits. On one occasion, Coe arrived, while being chased by federal soldiers. Hawley's wife's widowed ancestor, Susan, fed Coe, and then waited for him to fall asleep. She then sent her son Bud, in his early teens, to search for the soldiers and then bring them back to the homestead, even though she knew that if Coe woke while Bud was gone, that Coe might kill her. Which I'm kind of confused, because Bud is the son to search for the soldiers, sent the soldiers and bring them back to the homestead, putting the mom in a very dangerous position. So it seems like, the mom is being more brave and, being more, she's fitting their view of masculinity more than I think the son is here. Bud succeeded and Coe was captured, though. But for Hawley, this means various things. But it's the foremost a story of a young man becoming something every man is called to be, a warrior. Yet, as Hawley tells it, the most courage, again, I agree here, was shown by Susan. She was the one directly at risk. Moreover, Coe was a warrior, a Civil War veteran, and a charismatic leader in a malevolent sort of way. So he had a little hard on there for him. When Hawley writes elsewhere that men are part of God's solution to danger in the world, shouldn't he emphasize that a great deal of this danger in the world is also created by men? And again, I think that's like, he does kind of, Hawley, and just the general field of kind of men dealing with this. and kind of men dealing with their problems, men not being in, going to college as much, men dropping out of life, becoming disassociated, having social problems, not getting as high kind of economic prospects. Like that is, I think, definitely real. It's definitely a real problem worth addressing. And this kind of stuff just does not even, as I'm sure you can kind of tell, just does not even come close to it. All right, we have a very interesting final story for you here today out of the Biden administration, where through legislation, in the Inflation Reduction Act and the newly proposed Environmental Protection Agency regulations, they are apparently hoping to ensure that 2/3 of new passenger cars are completely electric by 2032. But while electric vehicles are certainly an environmental improvement over gas-powered vehicles, the Biden administration's current approach to EV transitioning could spell disaster for U.S. auto workers. Like many components of the IRA, the administration has chosen a model that throws out vast amounts of public money into electrical vehicle manufacturers without attracting any kind of label standards or attaching them to the deal and to the funds that they get. Again, probably one of the biggest themes that we continue to kind of harp on the show is the U.S. government subsidizes, gives, and gets absolutely nothing in return for the people that kind of vote for it, the everyday electorate. They just send money out, they just give it to companies, and the companies essentially do whatever they want with it. And really, there are very few conditions for it. But the UAW workers are seeing a bit of a problem with this, especially though their new reform leadership. That's UAW President Shawn Fain. He released a memo to union members after visiting with lawmakers in Washington. He made clear the UAW will not simply rubber stamp an endorsement of Joe Biden in 2024 if the president does change his stance on electrical vehicles. Also, while making clear the union would not back Donald Trump. The federal government is pouring billions into the electric vehicle transition with no strings attached and no commitment to workers. And the EV transition, he says, is at serious risk of becoming a race to the bottom. We need to see national leadership have our back on this before we make any commitments. Fain added that a pro-labor transition has to include standards for our members and future workers. These jobs should fall under our master agreements, and our members should have the rights to this work. Especially, big thing they're trying to do now as well, kind of concurrently to this, is organize some of these newer, both GM and other companies, these newer kind of electric plants here, because they're, so far, the auto companies have been able to kind of wrangle them out and get them separate from previous, internal combustion engine type plants where their, standard cars are built. But, this is a really good, really kind of interesting and important move, and it shows you when you get the right people, in charge. Like, Joe Biden here is really doing something that is really going to long term put a huge stunt in the growth of auto organizing, auto unions, and auto workers' protections. And instead of just having, really what would have happened in the past is someone, kind of a pro-Biden, pro-Democrat union boss would come in and say, okay, perfect, we've been through it, we're all good, yay Democrats, support the Democrats, vote for the Democrats, and now this is going to probably encourage, and this is, putting Michigan and all these other states where you get the kind of huge amounts of UAW workers. Michigan obviously going to be one of the biggest ones. But if they're not out there advocating, voting for, supporting Biden, this is really a pretty big deal. And it does show you one of the first times we've seen a left-wing progressive institution actually stand up to the Democratic Party and say, we are just not going to take you, completely at your word here. We're going to actually demand something for our support. We're not going to, fall right behind you just like everyone else is. And we're going to, really stand up here, because if we don't, we're really going to be fucked, again, excuse my French, when it comes down to it in the long term, because we're not going to have a contract here. And we do have, whatever power we have, and we're going to be able to use it as best as we can. So really, really commendable stuff there. One of the first times where you actually see a left-wing force standing up to Joe Biden, demanding something. Hopefully it works out well for them. And really, again, big kudos to them on not just giving their support up right away. So all the time we got. We'll be back on Wednesday. It's Newsflash.